Good morning. Welcome to another show of Veterans for Peace. My name is David Ross. I volunteered twice, served 2 tours in Vietnam as combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division. From what I saw, I have come to the conclusion that war is not the answer. I have with me the other person that works with me on the show, Dave Ransom. Dave, would you give people just a short background?
Well, I'm Dave Ransom, and was in the service and met during the Korean conflict, and met a chaplain who triggered me to redecide about going into ministry, and that's where I was. And when one of our dear presidents decided to blast another country apart, I decided I'd had enough, and saw a young gentleman, one of my parishioners, walk down the steps at the post office with a T-shirt that said "Veterans for Peace," and I said, "Where, Mike? Where did you get that?" And so I called a bunch of people on the phones, thanks to Jerry Genesio, and Andy Schoerke is one of them, and Dave Ross is another of them, and we got going, and it gives us this real privilege today to have a guest that can help us out.
And our guest today is Andy Schoerke, who is an expert on many topics, and he is going to talk about nuclear war, which is something that we maybe are perhaps so afraid of that we really don't talk about it much. Andy, you want to give a little background and then go ahead? Our format will be a little bit different. Usually we have a conversation with our guest, but because of Andy's expertise and the amount of information he wants to get to us, we're just going to let him run with the show, and then maybe if we have some time left over at the end, ask any questions if we think something needs clarification or expanding. Andy, take it away.
Oh, yeah, you better. I got my pen out. I think maybe the people listening may want to grab a pen and paper and take notes.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Dave's both.
So a little bit about your background and then right into it.
The purpose of this presentation is to make the people of Vermont aware of an impending situation that is likely to develop between the United States of America and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, otherwise known as North Korea. I'll begin my remarks by praising with an op-ed that was sent to the Bennington Banner and distributed through all my peace contacts here in Vermont. It's titled "Deter, Prepare, and Preempt." On October the 22nd, 1962, President John Kennedy announced the discovery of missiles on Cuba, stating, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." The Cuban Missile Crisis was the first instance when a U.S. president was prepared to order a preemptive strike against a nuclear-armed nation, viewed as a threat to the United States. A second instance occurred when President Bush ordered a preemptive attack on Iraq, which he believed had nuclear weapons to be launched at the United States. A third instance was in 2008, when President Bush again was prepared to order a preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities. Admiral William Fallon, commander of all U.S. Central Command forces, publicly said, however, that he would not allow such an order, and after meeting with the president at the White House, Admiral Fallon announced his resignation, and there was no attack on Iran. Each of the above examples represents the failure of the policy of deterring a nuclear-armed country from carrying out a nuclear attack on the United States. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had managed to tolerate each other's nuclear weapons over 40 years, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought both governments to the brink of a nuclear holocaust. Thankfully, the crisis was peacefully resolved through direct negotiations between President John Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In the case of Iraq, the preemptive shock and awe assault carried out on March 20, 2003 reflected the Bush administration's decision to eliminate possible nuclear weapons of mass destruction held by Iraq. And National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice has stated, "We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud," quote unquote. After the invasion of the country was thoroughly searched, but no nuclear weapons were ever found. In 2008, a preemptive strike on Iran was averted because the United States hacked into thousands of uranium enrichment machines and disabled them. Ultimately, in 2012, negotiations between the U.S., Iran, and 5 world powers resulted in a joint comprehensive plan of action commonly called the Iran deal, in which Iran gave up its nuclear weapons program. Currently, as stated by Secretary of Defense James Mattis and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Joseph Dunford, the greatest threat to U.S. national security is the ongoing development and testing of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles by North Korea. Although both of these top military officers have argued forcefully for using diplomacy to address Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions, the military is quietly preparing for a preemptive war they hope will never come. On January 24, 2017, House Bill H-669 and Senate Bill S-200 were introduced concurrently and were immediately remanded to the respective Foreign Relations Committees. The purpose of both bills was to prohibit President Trump from authorizing a preemptive nuclear strike. It is imperative that our congressional delegation hears from us, urging them to do whatever is necessary to bring both bills to the floor of Congress for a vote. I'd like to go over the brief current situation representing the North Korean threat. Over the last 15 years, North Korea has been developing missiles ranging from short range to intermediate range to international continental ballistic missiles. If we could have images 1 and 2, please. These images from left to right describe the development of the North Korean arsenal. They have a wide range of sizes and capabilities. Beginning on the left is the shorter range. The next one is the KN-11, and we'll see more of that later. It's a submarine-launched ballistic missile. The others represent the increasing developmental range of the North Korean missile system. This image depicts the firing of one of the North Korean missiles called the Hwasong-14. It is basically almost an intercontinental ballistic missile that does not quite have the range. This next image shows the missile, North Korean missile, the Hwasong-15. This missile was fired last November the 28th. The testing that the North Koreans do is to fire these missiles almost vertically, following a parabolic trajectory. The international people that observe these launches and calculate them believe that the Hwasong-15 has the capability to reach any target on the east coast of the United States. This next image shows the erecting of the Hwasong-15. The North Korean missiles are transported on large wheeled vehicles, the purpose of which is that they can move about, and instead of being a stationary target which could be easily attacked, they are mobile. They can hide the missile in a cave, in a tunnel, under a bridge, in a building, making it almost impossible to identify where the missile might be located. This next image shows the launch of the Hwasong-15, fired from after the missile has been erected and the carrying vehicle has departed. This next image shows the firing of a submarine-launched ballistic missile from a North Korean submarine. The range of this missile is believed to be about 500 to 600 miles. Not only does North Korea have a developing missile and nuclear threat, but it also has a conventional weapons threat. This image depicts a long-range North Korean artillery piece. It's a Russian-made piece. This image was taken from a captured cannon in Iraq. Presently, North Korea has massed lots of these, in the thousands of these artillery pieces along its border, the demilitarized zone between it and South Korea. This image shows the mass firing of these artillery pieces. It puts the outskirts of Seoul within range of these artillery pieces. Along the border, North Korea has massed thousands and thousands of its own troops, and that represents the actual image. The history of their nuclear weapons program began in the early 2000s because a renegade Pakistan scientist began selling blueprints for nuclear weapons to lots of countries, including North Korea, South Africa, Libya, Syria, and other countries like that. This image shows the North Korean test site at what's called at Manyan Mountain in northeast Korea. The image describes how they do their tests. They bore a tunnel into the side of a mountain, and at the end of the tunnel they put a J-hook on it, and that's where the test weapon is placed. The weapon is then detonated. The range of these tests, which began in 2006, was a magnitude of 4.1, magnitude representing the Richter scale, which can be detected by seismographic sensors. The next test was a magnitude 4.5 in 2009, then test 3, a magnitude of 4.9 in 2013, and in 2016 there were 2 tests, the first magnitude 4.8, the second one 5.3, and last November there was a 6th test of a magnitude which was calculated to be in the range of 6.3. It's the Richter scale is kind of a compressed scale. These tests represent a kiloton detonation force in a case of the test number 6 in a range of about 70 to 80 kilotons. The North Koreans brag that this is a hydrogen bomb, although we'll see later this may be a spurious account. Overriding this scenario, last fall, for the first time in 10 years, the national security strategy of the United States was changed. Before that time, the focus had been on countering terrorism. It was George Bush's global war on terror. That's what the U.S. military was focused on. Last fall, that focus was changed to meet the threats from Russia, China, and North Korea. Currently, the forces established are 50,000 military in Japan, 30,000 in South Korea, and 7,000 on Guam. These represent the Army, the Marine Corps, and Air Force. There is now currently undergoing a shift of these forces from the Middle East to the China-Indo area that would be a potential area of conflict. Right now, they are rotating Marine Expeditionary Units, which consist of about 2,200 Marines. They will be continually to rotate them. The Navy has been deploying a forward-based carrier strike group featuring nuclear aircraft carriers which can carry over 100 aircraft. It is also included in the strike group are 2 guided missile cruisers and guided missile destroyers as an escort force. Amongst other things decided in the change to the national military strategy was to develop new nuclear weapons. Perhaps you've read or heard about the administration's increasing a $1 trillion budget over 10 years, which was begun actually by President Obama, to develop new and different nuclear capabilities. Amongst these is the development of what are called, and you'll excuse it's not my word, to develop usable nuclear weapons. The purpose of which would be to not only retaliate a nuclear attack, but to retaliate any other kind of attack on the United States, including a cyber attack, a commercial attack. The language is very expansive as to how these usable nuclear weapons would be used. Part of the issue with the national security change is the contention of China claiming lots and lots of what formerly were little reefs, little shoals, little points of rock sticking up out of the South China Sea. China has unilaterally declared the South China Sea to be part of its nation. Their boundary line extends to within 100 miles of the Philippines and within 60 miles of South Korea. That represents the threat. And recently, on March the 1st, President Putin of the Federation of Russian Republics declared that he has now developed weapons that are invincible, that the U.S. defenses can do nothing to stop. In preparation to meet the threat from North Korea, the United States has done a couple of things, not counting President Trump's bombastic threats of fire and fury. My button's bigger than your button when he's talking to the North Korean Premier, Mr. Yoon Jong-un, and also including the demonizing of the North Korean country. If you recall seeing this demonization that he did at his address, the State of the Nation, he clearly indicated that the North Koreans are demons and that Sung Yong-in is a madman. There was a brief hiatus in the buildup of the threats, and I'm including not only the threat of the North Korean missile nuclear weapons, but also the threat of the United States weapons to strike preemptively against North Korea. There is lots of military contingency planning. The Pentagon has lots and lots of departments, probably buildings full of people whose only job is to plan for military actions as a contingency. Lots of these plans are contingent. Last January, President Trump called on the military to develop plans that were more flexible, that would allow him to use a plan to strike preemptively against North Korea. Most significantly, perhaps, in December, President Trump declared North Korea to be a state that enabled terrorism. This is quite significant because, as I said earlier, the focus of the U.S. military was against a terrorist threat. By declaring North Korea a terrorist state, what it does was also allow the president to declare unilaterally a state of war and make a preemptive strike. I'll talk more about this later. They are a state sponsor of terrorism officially. The current situation, experts, I can't name them specifically, but they're the inevitable experts, officials, authorities, whatever you want to call them, that they think that there may be a possible North Korean missile test over the Pacific this coming summer. One thing that was noticed about the earlier North Korean tests was that although they proved to successfully launch the rocket, the latest one, the Hwasong-15, achieved an altitude of about 2,100, 2,200 miles above the Earth. What none of these tests have shown or proven to be whether they are accurate, number one, and number two, whether or not they can re-enter the Earth's atmosphere without turning into a ball of fire. Those two essential characteristics are needed before any missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, and intermediate range missile can be really effective. So far, their tests have not proved that. In the meantime, because of the Olympic hiatus in these preparations, the government of South Vietnam under President Kim Jong-lee has been talking with representatives of the North Korea. And the idea is to establish some kind of talks between North Korea and the United States. President Trump is on record recently as declaring that he will talk with the North Koreans when conditions are right. Typically, traditionally, this has meant that the U.S. will talk to an opponent only on preconditions. Probably, in this case, a precondition being that North Korea publicly acknowledges it will not continue developing nuclear weapons or the rocket capability to deliver them. On March the 2nd, Kim Jong-un, president of North Korea, says, there will be no preconditions to any talk. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea must be recognized as a world nuclear power. So far, both of these opponents are refusing to talk, and they are both saying there will be no preconditions before we sit down and talk. Clearly, what's needed are negotiations. I think clearly what's needed, there has to be a stand down in the bravado, the bombastic threats from each country's head of state. There has to be no deal breaker so that negotiations can continue. One of the requirements of North Korea is that the South Korean government and the U.S. government must discontinue their joint military exercises. These exercises are held twice a year. They are something, apparently, that Kim Jong-un has great fear of, fearing that they will mask a preemptive attack on his country. What's needed is the United States, if the two heads of state don't agree to talk, the United States must send some kind of an official envoy to begin negotiations with North Korea. What's needed especially, and I have to make this a big point, is for our congressional delegation to do whatever it has to do to get the bills that prohibit President Trump from launching a preemptive strike on North Korea. They have to get out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the House and the Senate. All of our congressional delegates is on record as sponsoring those bills. That was introduced on January, are you ready for this? January the 24th. We're talking 5 days following President Trump's inauguration. That's when these bills were both introduced concurrently in the House and the Senate. And again, the purpose of the bills was to prohibit President Trump from launching a preemptive strike. It doesn't make any difference how our congressional delegation does it. Representative Welch was a co-sponsor of the bill that was introduced into the House, as was Senator Bernie Sanders, a co-sponsor of the bill that was introduced into the Senate. Senator Leahy is also a co-sponsor of the Senate Bill S-200, although he didn't sign up to be a co-sponsor until July, almost 6 months after it was introduced. Another thing that has to happen, which is critical, is for Congress to rescind the authorization to use military force. If you recall, this was the law that authorized the President of the United States to use any and all military force against, and the language was quite specific, to reduce and go after the Al-Qaeda perpetrators of the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Centers. The other specific language contained in that authorization to use military force was directed solely and completely at Al-Qaeda, as well as a nation state that was deemed to be harboring Al-Qaeda. At that time, it was thought to be Afghanistan. That is why in October, the United States began sending special forces into Afghanistan to counter and kill the threat from Al-Qaeda, who was in Pakistan. Without the authorization to use military force, a president of the United States has absolutely no power. On October the 12th, no power. To 1956, I raised my hand and swore to 1956, preserve and defend the hand and swore to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. The Constitution that I swore to uphold includes Section 8, stating the powers of Congress, and I quote, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." Continuing on the subparagraph, it adds, "Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water." It's quite specific. Congress, only Congress, has the power, the authority to declare war. That's why it's so important that the authorization to use military force be rescinded by Congress, so that the President of the United States cannot use that as a fig leaf to hide a preemptive attack on North Korea, citing as his authority the notion that he himself has put North Korea on the list of terrorist states. That's not going to make it. Following my receiving my naval commission in 1956, I attended the Naval Air Intelligence School in Anacostia, Washington. There I learned how to deploy, how to size, how to use nuclear weapons. Following that school, I received orders to report to Navy Heavy Attack Squadron 1, which at that time was embarked in the USS Forrestal. I reported to the squadron in September, and immediately we deployed on a NATO mission called Operation Strike Back, which kind of defined how the United States would respond to any kind of Soviet nuclear attack. While I was attached to Heavy Attack Squadron 1, I flew as a bombardier navigator on a long-range Navy bomber, which would be carried on a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. The aircraft was called, at that time, was a Douglas A-3D aircraft. I flew 200 on that hours in that aircraft. Following my release from active duty, I joined the Naval Reserve and attended drills at the Willow Grove Naval Air Station. On October 22nd, 1962, I was at home. I received a call from the naval officer who was in charge of administrating our Naval Reserve unit. In his call, he told me, in fact, he instructed me to pack a bag, stay by my phone for the next 24 hours, tell no one about this phone call, and that the United States was in Defense Condition 3. Defense Condition 3 is the third highest level of defense. If you think of it as the get ready part of the admonition, get ready, get set, go. DEFCON 3 was get ready, DEFCON 2 was get set, DEFCON 1 was go, meaning we were at war. The U.S. military is currently preparing for whatever threat might be posed either by China, Russia, or North Korea. Recently, they have ordered an additional carrier strike group into the Western Pacific to support the forward deployed carrier, the Ronald Reagan. It's curious to me that this second carrier strike group was that of the Fred M. Vinson, which had just come back from the Westpac the beginning of July. They were ordered to deploy on January the 25th, which is a little over 6 months turnaround for a carrier strike group, which is indeed very, very unusual, because having been with a Navy strike group and preparing for deployment, I know it takes at least a year and a half for a returning carrier strike group to be ready to be redeployed. The Vinson was turned around in 6 months. Currently, a third carrier strike group, the John Stennis, is preparing for deployment out of Bremerton, Washington. I thought that was very, very significant. In addition, I noted, and most of this comes from articles in the New York Times, which I can cite, three B-2 Air Force bombers have been deployed to the Adana Air Force Base on Guam. The B-2 bomber is the stealth bomber. There are already B-1 bombers, supersonic bombers, stationed at the Adana Air Force Base. In addition to that, the Army is in the process of setting up 28 mobilization centers throughout the country. The purpose of these would be to, if in the event a DEFCON 2 get set order would be ordered by the President, it would mean the immediate mobilizations of thousands and thousands of reservists to be called up. It would also mean probably the forward deployment of thousands and thousands more of U.S. military Army as well as Marines to either Okinawa or to other bases in the Pacific, possibly Japan. Perhaps the thing that caught my most attention was early in January, the Centers for Disease Control and Protection put out a notice of a briefing which they were going to have on January the 16th, a briefing that would deal with how the public was to deal with a nuclear attack. that was called off because saner heads figured that the flu epidemic was more important than that. It's important for all Vermonters, and I stress this, all Vermonters, to be aware of this increasing threat, to get a hold of our congressional delegation, have them do whatever they have to do. They need to be as circumspect, as ruthless as the current Senate Majority Leader, and block any nation and recover the bills that were included to stop Trump from launching a preemptive strike, bring them to the floor for a vote. The Congress has the only power to declare war.
We got a chance.
We have a chance. We have to take advantage of it. It's not too late.
We go back to World War I, World War II, or authorization to send troops for the United Nations effort that we orchestrated for the first Korean War. In all of those cases, Congress held a vote. I mean, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, December 7th, Roosevelt went before the United States Congress and he said, "This day shall live in infamy." You know, basically, we've been attacked, and I am here as your president to ask you to show the resolve to declare war on Japan. They declared war on Japan, and then declared war on, then Germany declared war on us, and we, again, Congress declared war on Germany. The same thing in World War I as in World War II. And then all of a sudden, we're talking about wars of choice. Only an idiot would choose a war. Only somebody who has never actually been in a war and seen what really is would choose a war.
Time.
So
10 seconds.
We don't need to choose another war. We are now, depending on how you look at it, we are fighting 7 or 8 wars. Enough. Nobody has voted for them. This authorizing, you know, this is like giving a child, Trump, the ability to just, oh, I think I'll have a war here. I mean, he's just sort of doing what he wants to do. So that's why Andy's here, because the stakes are too high now. Regular wars are horrific, but a nuclear war, I mean, the missiles that we have today, some of them are almost 100 times more powerful than the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If we ever have a full nuclear exchange with the Soviets, with the Chinese, maybe even the North Koreans, God only knows what they've got. If we have a major nuclear exchange, it will change this planet. Global warming will, you know, that dynamic has taken on a life of its own. But you will now have, I mean, just the volcano in Iceland, the later one in the Philippines, it stopped air traffic for all of Europe, parts of the U.S. That's just a nuclear exchange. You will have what's called a nuclear winter. You won't have crops.
I might mention in 1819, there was a huge volcanic eruption in off the island of Java, on an island of Tambora. It put into the atmosphere, what I've read, approximately 10 cubic miles of Earth. It's known, perhaps in Vermont, as the year without a summer. That was from that volcanic explosion.
And in Europe, it was called the Little Ice Age.
Yeah. The thing that I have to emphasize is that, as demonstrated by the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was only the negotiations that really brought that to an end. What is not known is that it got down to a single Soviet naval officer to prevent World War III. Unknown to the United States, you may recall that there were 4 Russian cargo ships which were approaching Cuba, each of them carrying missiles. What's not known, that each one of those 4 Russian transport ships was being shepherded by a Russian submarine, each of which had a nuclear torpedo. The protocol was that for the submarine to launch that torpedo, it needed the sign-off of both the commanding officer of the submarine as well as the political officer on the submarine. On each of those 4 Russian submarines, each of those 2 people signed off to release a nuclear torpedo against a Navy ship. What prevented it was the single voice of the Navy captain of the Russian Navy, Soviet Navy captain who had oversight over all of those Russian submarines. He refused to give his authorization. His name was Vasily Arkotov. He is the man that basically prevented a nuclear war that would probably have devastated the entire planet if the Soviet Union and the Russia had got into a fight with approximately 50 to 60,000 nuclear warheads. That's how close the Cuban Missile Crisis was. It resulted in direct negotiations. That has to happen between the United States and North Korea. The thing that I'm going to be alert to over the summer is perhaps increasing propaganda from the administration about how dangerous North Korea was and what peril the United States was in. We saw this happening when George Bush was on his run-up to strike a war against Iraq. Millions and millions of people were in the streets in this country and worldwide to try to stop that war. They were simply dismissed as representing special interests, was the language that was used.
Yeah.
Special interests, millions of people in the streets. That's why I think it's most important that we have to work through Congress. Our congressional delegation, they have the key. They must have the fortitude, they must have the know-how to prevent President Trump from launching a preemptive strike. So whatever you do, contact your congressman, contact your senator, get a hold of somebody, get a hold of people in their office, get a hold of people on their staff who will be able to convey that message. For your information, call Peter Welsh. His phone number in Washington is 202-225-4115. Call Bernie Sanders' office in Washington, 202-224-5141. Call Patrick Leahy's office in Washington, 202-224-4242. If you have the opportunity, go to their congressional offices in Washington, in Burlington, in Montpelier. Let them know your concern. Talk to your friends, talk to anybody. Raise awareness, raise awareness. We cannot allow this to happen.
And there are other resources too that you just began to talk about them, so that maybe there may be people out there, Andy, who just don't have the sense that particularly you two guys have of being in the midst of war. And now we're talking about a war that would be thousands of times worse than the wars that we were even talking about.
It might very well be the extinction of the human race. You're talking about,
yeah, that's what
forget
we're
it,
talking
the
about.
supermarkets are gone, the farms are gone, the sun is gone, it's dark, it's snowing, it's cold. What are you going to do? Go to your neighbor's house, burn their house while you eat your neighbor to stay alive? That is almost what it would come down to. It's basically the end.
And how do we
There was a great movie called War Games.
Yeah.
And a long story short, little kid hacks into a Pentagon computer, and that computer, because they don't trust human judgment, that computer now has direct control of the entire American nuclear arsenal, and if certain conditions are met, it will initiate a full-out strike. And it sort of comes down to a situation where it looks like this is going to happen, and Wopar, the warmonger computer, is friends with this little kid, plays chess with him and other games. That computer is ready to launch the end of humanity, and the kid says, well, what about tic-tac-toe?
Yeah.
And it puts tic-tac-toe up on the screen, yeah, and plays a bunch of, well, it's kind of a no-win game if you play it right.
Yeah.
And then he starts with scenarios. They launch, we launch, somebody else launches. And it starts going through, and it goes faster and faster and faster. All these launches, every possible scenario for full launch, partial launch, launch on a section. And finally the screen goes blank, and the computer says, the only way to win is not to play. We cannot afford to have President Trump playing with the future. He's an unstable human. He is radical in his thinking in the sense that he doesn't make sense. He is not consistent. He hires people and fires people as fast as he did on the TV show. Yeah, he's a genius, but he's an evil genius. I don't trust him. He panders to a very particular segment of the population. His values are not only askance compared to most Americans, he's not even consistent. He doesn't even know what his values are.
Right.
He is a dangerous, dangerous person. We, the American people, have made a horrible mistake.
And to get
And
back
the
to
only way to avoid, the only way to win is not to play,
right.
is to tighten up the game so somebody can't just, oh, what a beautiful day. I think I'll have World War III. Yeah.
Can I get back to Andy's question too, Dave, about the, as you're talking about the Constitution, how did we ever give the president the authority to go to war if constitutionally it's illegal?
It started after the Vietnam War when President Johnson, if you recall, first there was a contingent of Marines sent to the air base at Da Nang to protect it. And the next thing you know, the Viet Cong, they started lobbing mortars and stuff at the Marines at Da Nang, which of course required the U.S. to send more Marines to protect the Marines that were there to protect the airfield. And the next thing you know, it escalated. It escalated. The president kept calling for more and more troops in response to the American generals who said, we need more and more troops to defeat the Viet Cong. And they did it. And it was actually President Johnson who initiated, it was actually a preemptive war, who initiated that. The Congress, after the war ended, at least for the U.S., thought up, we have to come up with some way to restrict the president, any president, from doing this. What they did was they passed a law called the War Powers Act, which basically says, okay, if a president wants to start a war, he's got to report back to Congress in 60 days and say why he did it, how it's going, and all that stuff. But let's face it, in the case of a peremptory nuclear attack, what in the world is 60 days? 60 days is nothing.
No.
It's nothing. But that was the only congressional response to that. That and the later authorization to use military force.
It goes back even farther than that, because when the Indo-Chinese liberation fighters under Ho Chi Minh, the so-called Viet Minh, defeated the French decisively at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the French sued for peace. There was an agreement called the Geneva Accords. One of the many stipulations was that there were to be elections held where both zones, there never was a North Vietnam or a South Vietnam. There were a temporary demarcation line to allow French and Vietnamese forces to separate to end the combat and the killing. And that in 1958 there were to be elections in both zones to reunify the country under as a single state with a single leader. And everyone, Eisenhower, and this is a direct quote from Mandate for Change, his memoir, I have never talked or corresponded with anyone knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that, had elections been held at the time of fighting, perhaps upwards of 80% of the people would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh. Yes, he was the master of the run-on sentence.
I'd like to raise...
just a sec. And those elections weren't held. They were not held because people in South Vietnam, the moneyed interest, as always, backed by the United States government and their international gaming over world dominance, refused to hold the elections. Then, Ngo Dinh Diem, a leader selected, approved by Kennedy, because Kennedy wanted to find, who should we have for a leader? He asked Cardinal Spellman, the head of the Catholic diocese in New York City, who do we have in Vietnam that will lead the country? He says, Ngo Dinh Diem is a good Catholic. He'll do a great job. Well, on that, we put this guy in power in a country that was about 9 to 11% Catholic. The rest were Buddhist or other religions. We put a Catholic in power. He immediately went out into the countryside. They actually had real guillotines. They went out in the countryside and they shot and they guillotined all the former Viet Minh resistance fighters they could get. And finally, of course, the war broke out. But what happened before that was that the United States, in getting all this set to get a war, was conducting commando operations in the northern zone, the temporary zone across the temporary border. So we were sending commandos up there. They were South Vietnamese commando teams, and they pretty much all disappeared. They just disappeared. Then the people went to, also the South Vietnamese and Americans were shelling with naval ships. They were shelling North Vietnam. A couple of PT boats got involved, but the bottom line was the president said, "We have been attacked by the naval forces of North Vietnam. I want unrestricted use of military power to suppress this behavior." Well, they were checking out the people that were blowing up their country, and you know, we'd been doing this for a long time. But the commander of the Turner Joy, which was the primary ship, also the Maddox, they have come out on public record, come to my house and see it in print. No, they were not attacked by North Vietnamese boats. It was a lie. So we lied our way into a war just like we lied our way into Iraq.
Yeah.
Just lies.
I have a couple of important points I have to make.
Yeah.
Please.
Right now, what's also happening are the sanctions imposed by the United Nations are in effect against North Vietnam. The intention is to force the North Vietnamese to give up their nuclear weapons program.
North Korea.
Recently, it was discovered that 7 countries were avoiding these sanctions by shipping materials to North Vietnam. There is a danger that an incident would happen with trying to interdict or stop one of these foreign ships from going either supplying North Vietnam or taking stuff out of North Korea.
I'm sorry,
you,
yeah.
or
Okay.
North Korea from selling stuff like coal to other countries. There is a danger there that the United States may change its policy to what's called a stop, search, and seize policy, which was what they employed against Iraq to keep Iraq from breaking those sanctions. The other thing I have to bring up is that on about February the 11th, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence warned to a Senate Intelligence Committee that time was running out for the United States to act on the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons programs. North Korea presents a potentially existential threat to the United States. What that means is that this man is warning that the very existence of the United States is in jeopardy. It's decision time. It's something must be done to prevent the United States from attacking North Korea.
And we want some more messy democracy to happen while Vladimir Putin is saying, oh, that's your weakness.
Yeah, I'd have to mention that the images that were shown here, some of them come from North Korea, which carries with it a little bit of maybe conjecture, shall we say. For example, the image that showed the launch of the Hwasong 15, it was a night launch. People have looked at the star pattern shown in the background of the photograph, and in an attempt to figure out where this launch was held. They figured they could do some geometry and all that kind of stuff and figure out where this thing was launched. What they noticed was that the star pattern showed that not only was the Big Dipper there, but Orion was right beside it. Celestially, that's an impossibility. So the message is you got to take a grain of salt with anything that comes out of the North Korea. The other thing that was shown was an image of Kim Jong-un looking at what they declare to be I'll read the caption. North Korea released a photograph of the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, inspecting what it said was a hydrogen bomb that could be fitted onto a missile. Hours later, it carried out its 6th nuclear test. That's pure conjecture on the part of anybody who looks at that and believes what the North Vietnamese say that it is.
Koreans.
There is a lot of differences between what propaganda is put out by North Korea and what the actual facts are. The launching of those missiles, they are facts. They were followed. The detonation of their nuclear weapons tests are facts because they were recorded on seismographs in Japan and the United States. That's the reality of it.
There's another footnote that needs to, so many things need to be slid in from the edges.
Yeah.
Israel, under the same laws and agreements that we are attacking North Korea and have gone after Iran about non-nuclear proliferation. Well, Israel has the atomic bomb. Who gave them an exemption? Who is criticizing Israel for having atomic bombs? And given the history of Israel, is my kindergarten thing had a thing, I didn't get it, but does not play well with others. Israel has never played well with others in that part of the world. And if I were Syria or Iran or one of those places, I'd want to have atomic bombs if Israel had atomic bombs. So we're what? America's favoring selective proliferation? Another piece of hypocrisy that is just so standard to everything that my country does these days. So I think that given the fact that some things you can fix or survive, I mean, shock and awe, the war against Iraq. And I have personal friends that are Iraqi, and they've been really hurt in this war. That was all lies. One of my friends grew up there as a child. She suffered a lot because of the sanctions. They couldn't get medicine. They couldn't get vitamins. They couldn't get medical supplies. I mean, we basically just stopped everything from going into that country. And Saddam Hussein, he was as anti-Islamic extremist as you could get. My friend told me it was very simple. Saddam told the mullahs, you are here to offer to our people the word of God as revealed by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You will stay in the mosque and you will teach the people. I am the politics of this country. I don't come into your area of authorization and what you do. You stay out of my politics. I am the politics. And my friend said, if you kept your mouth shut, actually you could have a very nice life. Free education, free medicine. Some people horribly poor, but they did eat, they did have a roof. Other people really rich, especially if they were well connected politically. It was a corrupt government. But the last thing that he would put up with was any form of radical Islam in his country threatening his absolute control. That was all a lie.
That's it.
The war in Vietnam, all a lie. I mean, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in front of the United Nations, they just stood up there and lied their little hearts out. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, wounded, homeless. The birth of ISIS, the very opening of the gates of hell and the horrors that followed. Every one of our modern wars has been started by a lie. And then they turn back and say, oh, it was a tragic mistake. You know what? A tragic mistake is when a healthy young person's walking down the street, they slip on a banana peel and get crippled. That's a tragic mistake. These wars are so absolutely ruthlessly deliberate, all behind a huge edifice of lies, and a Congress that seems to check its spines in the courtroom when they go to work.
Well, these books
better get on these Congress people. No war on Korea, no war on Syria, no war on Iran. Right. The troops that we have in Syria now, get them the hell out. The people that we funded that led to all this horror in Syria, stop funding them. Let them come here. Give them one of our states, which is what we should have given the Vietnamese Louisiana. Sorry, I'm cheeky about that. You know, we caused this, but we don't stick around to pick up the pieces and pay the price of rebuilding and everything else. It's like a great elephant cartoon about Vietnam. Horizon to horizon bomb craters, little Vietnamese family standing on the edge of the horizon, bombers leaving, tanks and trucks leaving, and the Vietnamese say, thanks a lot.
2 minutes. Yeah. As a footnote to what you were just saying, Dave, I don't think anybody knows it, but in the year 2000, the United Nations Children's International Fund, UNICEF, reported to the General Assembly that because of the sanctions that were imposed against Iraq before the 1991, after the 1991 war with Iraq, over 500,000 Iraqi children died because of those sanctions. They died because the U.S. had destroyed the potable water systems. They had destroyed the sewage treatment systems. They had limited, as Dave mentioned, the medical and food supplies going into that country. And this was a report to the United Nations that, as I recall correctly, the number they estimated was 576,000 Iraqi children died because of those sanctions.
And asked at the United Nations, our ambassador, Madeleine Albright, she was asked, even the children, do you think it was worth it? Madeleine Albright replied, yes, we think it was worth it. Well, America, if you think it's worth it to murder 500,000 children, I don't want to hear about 17,000 in Florida. I'm broken. I'm heart-rent over this. But get a perspective, America. What's happening here is a joke compared to what we day after day inflict on the rest of the world. And now we're on the possible verge of ending the human experiment. Thanks, God, but we totally failed you. Just go ahead and have your big nuclear war.
Vermonters, do something. Talk to your friends. Join a peace group. Form a peace group. Join Veterans for Peace. We're always willing and anxious to help you deal with issues that you might have, but do something. You've got to do something.
And if you need help organizing, I teach how to organize. Get a hold of David Ross through Veterans for Peace. I'm a nonviolence instructor with very serious credentials, and I can teach you everything you need to know about how to create an organization, create media, create events. I've got 50 years experience doing this. I'm glad to come out and work.
You bet.
So I think that brings us to the end of our time. And we thank you for watching. We hope that you've learned something. We hope that you'll act on it. Special thanks for Andy Schoerke.